And now, people of Gotham City, the moment you have all been waiting for.
Can you still do the Joker laugh?
Oh, sure.
Well, do a little bit for us.
They remember the smile-faced, charming, effortless, almost too perfect a question. A man who seemed born to entertain, to glide across screens with a confidence that never faltered, a presence that never cracked. But behind that polished image, behind the laughter and the iconic roles that defined an era, there was a story far more complex, far more human, and far more haunting than anyone ever imagined. The world saw a performer who embraced flamboyance, who turned even the most exaggerated characters into unforgettable legends, yet few ever stopped to ask what it cost him to live that life under constant scrutiny, bound by expectations that demanded perfection while denying authenticity. He mastered the art of illusion, not just on screen, but in his personal life, crafting a persona that audiences adored while quietly guarding truths that, in his time, could have shattered everything he had built. In an industry that thrived on image, where deviation from the norm was not just discouraged but punished, he learned to navigate a delicate balance between visibility and invisibility, between being seen and never fully known. As the cameras rolled and the applause grew louder, so too did the pressure to maintain that carefully constructed identity. He became a symbol, a fixture of entertainment history, yet symbols are rarely allowed to be human. Every performance carried an unspoken weight. Every smile concealed the discipline and restraint required to survive in a world that celebrated him conditionally. Those who worked alongside him often spoke of his professionalism, his elegance, his ability to command attention without effort. But beneath that admiration lingered a quiet mystery, an unspoken understanding that there was more to him than met the eye. The roles he chose, the way he carried himself, even the subtle defiance in his performances hinted at a deeper narrative, one that could not be openly expressed but refused to be entirely silenced. Time moved forward, as it always does, and with it came a shifting cultural landscape that began to question the very rules he had spent a lifetime obeying. What once had to be hidden slowly emerged into the light, and with that change came a re-evaluation of the past, of the lives lived in secrecy, of the sacrifices made in silence. His story, once viewed through a narrow lens of entertainment and nostalgia, began to take on new meaning, revealing layers that had long been overlooked. The laughter he inspired was real, the joy he brought undeniable, but so too was the complexity of the world he navigated, a world that demanded conformity while quietly benefiting from the very uniqueness it refused to fully. To understand him now is to look beyond the surface, to see not just a performer but the person who existed within, and sometimes in spite of, the role he played for the world. It is to recognize the courage required to endure, to succeed, and to leave behind a legacy that continues to resonate, not just for what was shown, but for what was hidden. Because when the curtain finally falls and the illusion fades, what remains is not just a memory of a character, but the story of a life lived between truth and expectation, between brilliance and restraint. And once you see that, once you truly understand the weight of what was carried behind that unforgettable smile, you realize something profound. You will never remember him the same way again. And yet, the deeper you look, the more the contradictions begin to surface, like fragments of a story that was never meant to be told all at once. There were moments, fleeting and almost imperceptible, where the mask seemed to slip, where the performance gave way to something raw and undeniably real. Those who paid close attention could sense it, in the pauses between words, in the intensity behind his eyes, in the way he carried himself when he thought no one was watching. It was as if he existed in two worlds simultaneously, one illuminated by spotlight and applause, the other hidden in shadows where honesty could exist without consequence. And perhaps that duality is what made him so captivating, so impossible to forget, because even when he was playing a role, there was always a trace of something deeper, something unresolved. The industry that elevated him was also the very force that confined him, shaping not just his career but the boundaries of his identity. It demanded consistency, predictability, and above all, silence about anything that might disrupt the illusion. And so he became a master of control, not just over his craft but over himself, learning when to speak, when to deflect, and when to disappear into the safety of his own carefully constructed image. It wasn't just about survival. It was about endurance, about finding a way to thrive in a system that offered success at the cost of authenticity. And he paid that price with grace, never allowing the cracks to become fractures, never letting the world see the full weight of what he carried. But history is a way of uncovering what was once buried, of re-examining the past through a lens that is sharper, more compassionate, and more willing to confront uncomfortable truths. What was once dismissed or ignored now demands attention, and in that process, his life begins to take on a new significance. No longer just a figure of entertainment, he becomes a symbol of resilience, of quiet defiance, of a generation that lived with constraints that are difficult to fully comprehend today. His story is no longer just about what he achieved, but about what he endured to achieve it, and that distinction changes everything that IT forces us to reconsider not just who he was, but how we remember him. Because memory, like performance, can be selective. It can focus on the highlights, the laughter, the brilliance, while conveniently overlooking complexity that lies beneath. But when you allow yourself to see the full picture, when you begin to connect the dots that were once scattered and incomplete, a different narrative emerges, one that is richer, more honest, and infinitely more powerful. It's a narrative that challenges the simplicity of nostalgia and replaces it with something far more meaningful, understanding. And in that understanding, there's a quiet reckoning, a realization that behind every iconic figure, every beloved performance, there's a human being navigating a reality that is rarely as glamorous as it appears. A recognition that the legacy we celebrate is often built on sacrifices we never witnessed, struggles we never acknowledged, and truths that were never allowed to be spoken aloud. It doesn't diminish what he accomplished. It deepens it, adds weight to it, transforms it from mere entertainment into something that resonates on a profoundly human level. So when you think of him now, when his image comes to mind and the familiar smile returns, it won't feel quite the same. Because now you will see beyond it. You will sense the layers, the hidden stories, the quiet strength that defined his journey in ways the world was never meant to fully see. And that awareness, that shift in perspective, is what makes a story unforgettable in a way it never would before. And as the silence between the past and the present begins to close, what emerges is not just a clearer picture of the man, but a deeper understanding of the era that shaped him. It was a time when image was everything, when studios held power not only over careers but over identities, when a single revelation could unravel a lifetime of work in an instant. Within that world, he didn't just perform, he adapted, he calculated, he endured. Every decision carried consequences, every appearance was measured, every word carefully chosen to maintain a balance so fragile it could collapse under the slightest pressure. And yet, through all of that, he remained magnetic, unforgettable, almost untouchable in the way he commanded attention without ever revealing too much. There is something almost cinematic in the way his life unfolded, an ongoing narrative filled with triumphs that the world applauded and struggles that remained hidden behind closed doors. The contrast between those two realities is what makes his story so compelling, because it forces us to confront the illusion we so willingly accept. We celebrate the finished performance, the polished result, rarely questioning the cost of its creation. But in his case, the cost wasn't just long hours of professional sacrifices. It was personal truth, carefully concealed and quietly carried for decades. Those who knew him, even if only in passing, often described an energy that lingered, something just beneath the surface that couldn't quite be defined. It wasn't sadness, not exactly, nor was it regret in any obvious sense. It was something more subtle, more complex, a kind of awareness, perhaps, of the life he was living versus a life he might have lived under different circumstances. And that awareness didn't weaken him. If anything, it sharpened him, giving his performances an edge, a depth that audiences could feel even if they couldn't fully explain it. As time continues to move forward, the distance between then and now allows us to ask questions that once felt forbidden. What did it truly mean to exist in a world where authenticity came with risk? How many moments of honesty were sacrificed in favor of survival? And perhaps most importantly, how do we honor a legacy that was built within those constraints? The answers are not simple, and they are not meant to be. But in asking them, we begin to see him not just as an entertainer frozen in time, but as a person who navigated a reality that demanded strength in ways that often went unnoticed. And maybe that is where the real transformation happens, not in uncovering some single, shocking truth, but in allowing the full weight of his story to settle in recognizing that what made him extraordinary wasn't just his talent or his charisma, but his ability to exist within a system that required constant compromise without ever losing the essence of what made him captivating in the first place. That balance, that quiet resilience, becomes a defining element of his legacy, far more powerful than any one role performance. Because when the lights fade and the applause becomes an echo, what remains is not just what we saw, but what we now understand. A life lived with precision, with caution, with undeniable brilliance, but also with a depth that was never fully revealed until long after the curtain had closed. And once that understanding takes hold, it changes everything. It reshapes memory, reframes admiration, and transforms familiar figure into something far more profound. So the next time his image appears, the next time that unmistakable presence comes into view, there will be a pause, a moment where admiration meets awareness. And in that moment, the illusion will give way to something far more meaningful, the truth behind it, not loud, not dramatic, but quietly powerful in a way that lingers long after the story ends. And in that lingering silence, where reflection begins to replace simple remembrance, there is a final realization that settles in, one that cannot be easily shaken. The life he lived was not just a performance for the world, but a negotiation with it, a constant recalibration between who he was allowed to be and who he truly was beneath it all. The brilliance we celebrate today did not exist in isolation. It was shaped, refined, and at times constrained by forces that demanded both excellence and invisibility in equal measure. And somehow, against those odds, he managed to leave behind something enduring, something that continues to captivate even as a full story slowly comes into focus. There's a certain weight to that kind of legacy. It's not the loud, obvious kind that announces itself with grand revelations or dramatic confessions. Instead, it unfolds quietly, almost reluctantly, revealing itself piece by piece as time allows for a deeper understanding. What once seemed simple becomes layered. What once felt familiar now carries an undercurrent of complexity that cannot be ignored. And in that transformation, we are forced to confront not just who he was, but how we, as an audience, participated in the illusion, how we accepted the surface without questioning what lay beneath. It is easy, in hindsight, to wish things had been different, to imagine a world where he could have lived more openly, more freely, without the need for such careful restraint. But to truly understand his story is not to rewrite it. It is to see it clearly, in all its nuance, and to recognize the strength it took to navigate it as it was. Because strength does not always announce itself through defiance. Sometimes it reveals itself through endurance, through the ability to carry on, to succeed, and to leave an impact even when the circumstances are less than ideal. And perhaps that is why his presence still feels so powerful today. Not just because of what he did on screen, but because of what he represents beyond it. A reminder of an era of unspoken truths, of lives lived in the spaces between expectation and reality. His performances remain, preserved in time, still capable of bringing joy, laughter, and fascination. But now, they carry something more. They carry context. They carry history. They carry the quiet echoes of a story that was never fully told, but can now finally be understood. In the end, what changes is not the work itself, but the way we see it. The smile is still there, the charm still undeniable, the talent still undeniable. But now, it is all framed by something deeper, something that adds gravity to every moment he ever gave to the screen. And once that perspective takes hold, it becomes impossible to return to the simpler version of memory we once held on to. Because now, every glance, every gesture, every performance feels like a glimpse into something more than just entertainment. It feels like a window into a life lived with extraordinary care and quiet courage. So when the story finally settles, when the last image fades and the final note of reflection lingers, what remains is not just admiration, but respect of a different kind. The kind that acknowledges not only what was achieved, but what was endured to achieve it. And in that understanding, his legacy becomes something far greater than it ever was before, not just a collection of roles or moments, but a testament to the complexity of being human in a world that often demands simplicity. And that is why, once you truly see it, once you allow yourself to understand the full depth of his journey, you cannot go back. The memory is no longer untouched, no longer one-dimensional. It has evolved, expanded, deepened into something that stays with you, something that challenges you to look beyond the surface, not just in his story, but in every story that seems too perfect to question. Because sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones that were hidden in plain sight all along. And even after everything has been said, after every layer has been carefully uncovered and every silence has been given meaning, there is still something that refuses to fully settle, a feeling that his story is not entirely finished, not because there are facts left undiscovered, but because the impact of what he lived continues to ripple outward in ways that are still being understood. That is the nature of lives like his. They do not end when the curtain falls. They evolve, reshaped by each generation that looks back in days to see more than what was originally presented. There is a quiet power in that evolution. It transforms him from a figure of the past into something far more present, far more relevant than anyone could have predicted. Because in understanding what he endured, we begin to recognize patterns that still exist, pressures that have not entirely disappeared, and the subtle ways in which image can still overshadow truth. His story becomes more than personal. It becomes universal, a reflection of what it means to exist in a world that often rewards conformity while quietly fearing authenticity, and perhaps that is why his image lingers so strongly, why it refuses to fade into the comfortable distance of nostalgia. There is something unfinished about it, something that continues to ask questions long after the answers should have been obvious. It invites us to look closer, to reconsider not just him, but the countless others who live similar lives in silence, whose stories remain partially hidden, waiting for the same kind of understanding. In that sense, he is not alone. He is part of something much larger, a narrative that stretches far beyond a single lifetime. But what makes his story so striking is the grace with which he carried it. There was no public unraveling, no dramatic breaking point that forced the truth into the open. Instead, there was composure, control, and an unwavering commitment to the image he chose to present. And while that may seem, at first glance, like a limitation, it can also be seen as a form of quiet strength, a decision to define himself on his own terms, even within the confines of a system that offered very little freedom. As we look back now, with the benefit of time and perspective, it becomes clear that the real tragedy was not in what he hid, but in the necessity of hiding it at all. And yet, even within that limitation, he created something lasting, something meaningful, something that continues to resonate far beyond the era in which it was born. That is not just talent, that is resilience, shaped by circumstances and refined through years of careful navigation. So the story does not end with a single realization or a final revelation. It lingers, it expands, it continues to unfold in the minds of those who are willing to see it for what it truly is. A life that was both extraordinary and constrained, both celebrated and carefully guarded, both visible and deeply private. And in that duality, there is something profoundly human, something that connects across time, across generations, across the ever-changing landscape of what it means to be seen and understood. In the end, what stays with you is not just the image you once knew, but the deeper truth that now exists alongside it. The awareness that behind every polished moment was a reality far more complex, far more fragile, and far more courageous than anyone realized at the time. And once that awareness becomes part of the memory, it cannot be separated from it. Because now, when you think of him, you won't just see the performance, you'll feel the weight behind it. You won't just remember the roles, you'll sense the life that existed beyond them. And that shift, that quiet but undeniable transformation in perspective, is what ensures that his story will never fade, never lose its impact, never return to what it once was. And still, even with all that has been uncovered and understood, there remains a haunting sense that we are only now beginning to truly see him, not as the world insisted he be remembered, but as a man who existed within a carefully constructed illusion that both elevated and confined him. The passage of time is a way of softening certain truths while sharpening others, and in his case, it has done something even more profound. It has allowed the silence